I sent a cruel audio to the boss while he was with my wife at their house together. The moment I pressed the send button, my heart didn't beat faster, I didn't tremble, I didn't hesitate. I already knew about all the betrayal. I had already chewed on every detail of this disgusting farce. He had already spent sleepless nights imagining what it would be like when he finally pulled the rug out from under them. What I didn't know, what even I couldn't predict, was the exact expression that would take over their faces when they heard my voice echoing through the environment where they felt so safe, so in control, so untouchable. The silence before impact was deafening. I can even imagine the wide eyes, the suspended breath, the moment the blood froze in his veins. They were not prepared for what they would hear. They thought they were ahead, that they were smart, that they could play with my confidence like it was an old toy thrown in a corner. But they weren't ready for that. Their betrayal was not an impulsive mistake, a momentary lapse of passion. No. It was engineered, it was meticulously hidden under fake smiles, empty caresses, worthless promises. It was built on lies so well crafted that they almost seemed like truths. Almost. But I saw the signs. I felt every detail slowly shattering before me. The sudden change in behavior, the calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, the perfume that wasn't mine, the schedules that started to make no sense. Instinct is never wrong. And when the pieces started to fall into place, I didn't hesitate. They underestimated me. They thought they could keep making me look like a fool, that they could keep up this lie for as long as they wanted, that I would just accept whatever they told me. But I have never been a man who accepts defeat in silence. I've always been someone who returns the blow with the same intensity. Now, just imagine the scene. He, the man who sat across from me at work, the man who feigned respect, who patted me on the back, who shared jokes in meetings. He, sitting comfortably in his own house, perhaps with a glass of whiskey in his hand, a smile on his lips, believing that this was another ordinary night of clandestine pleasure. She, the woman who swore her love to me, who lay beside me for years, who held my hand and promised to be faithful. She, delivered into the arms of another man, inside a home that should be ours. And suddenly, the sound of the cell phone vibrates. The notification lights up the screen. An audio message. From me. What was going through their minds at that moment? Despair? Panic? Or did it take them a few seconds to understand that that audio was much more than an inconvenient coincidence? I wonder if he hesitated before pressing play, if his fingers trembled as he swiped across the screen. I wonder if she froze, if the smile died before the sound of my voice even filled the room. I wonder if her heart sank into her chest like a stone thrown into the bottom of an endless well. I know exactly what I said in that audio. Every word was handpicked. I wanted it to hurt. I wanted it to go into the skin like sharp blades. I wanted them to understand, once and for all, that there was no going back. The silence that came after was a muffled scream. They noticed. They understood. This wasn't just a message from a betrayed husband, it wasn't an emotional outburst from someone hurt. It was a calculated blow. It was a sentence. And in that moment, in that very second, they knew that their lives would never be the same. But what did I say? What was so cruel, so devastating, so merciless that it knocked the air from their lungs? What did I reveal that caused everything to fall apart in a way they could never fix? Now they know. But have they realized that this was just the beginning? Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized or justified. All the stories are fictional, but the pain, consequences and lessons are real. The moral is clear: betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust and leaves irreversible marks. Get ready for an intense story, full of twists and turns, where lies have a price and each action has a consequence. Now, take a deep breath, because what comes next is going to shock you. The clock was almost 9 at night when Daniel parked the car in the garage at home, the headlights illuminating the impeccable white door of the residence where he had built his life alongside Laura. Exhausted, he passed his hand over his face, feeling the weight of the day full of meetings, unattainable goals and constant demands. The work at the technology company where he was a manager had always demanded a lot from him, but lately it seemed to suck up even the moments when he should have been breathing. And yet, as he turned off the engine and looked up at the lighted window on the second floor, where Laura was probably getting ready for bed, he felt that familiar warmth of belonging, that relief that only the thought of returning home gave him. He got out of the car, took a deep breath, and allowed himself to forget his tiredness for a second. This house was his refuge, his safe world, where his wife waited for him, where their love had grown, where he believed that everything still made sense. The room was spotless, as always. Laura was extremely organized, something that had always impressed him. Small details gave that personal touch, an open book on the coffee table, a scented candle lit in the corner, and the soft aroma of chamomile tea that she loved to prepare before bed. He smiled as he imagined the scene, went up the stairs in silence, and when he reached the bedroom door, he found Laura lying on the bed, absorbed in her cell phone screen. She wore a light silk robe, her loose hair falling over her shoulders, and when she saw him, she looked up for a moment, offering a quick smile before returning to what she was doing. Daniel noticed the tiredness in her eyes, or perhaps it was distraction, a certain distance that, for some time, he had been noticing, but had never allowed himself to question. He sat on the edge of the bed and ran his hand up her leg, feeling the soft skin under his fingers, and asked if the day had been good. She hesitated for a second before answering yes, that she had gone to the mall, met a friend for lunch and spent the rest of the afternoon running errands at home. Daniel wanted to ask more, wanted to pull her closer, feel her presence like before, but he didn't. Lately, there was something different about her, an air of lightness mixed with impatience, as if she was always waiting for something. He didn't want to seem suffocating, so he just nodded, smiled, kissed her forehead and went to the bathroom. Hot water ran down his body as he closed his eyes and tried to push away the uncomfortable thoughts. What was happening to them? When did routine start to replace desire, when touches became less intense, when dialogues shortened to protocol phrases? Maybe it was just time, maybe it was normal after years together. Laura had always been passionate, engaging, full of life, and he always believed he was enough for her. But what if it wasn't? The thought bothered him, but he pushed it away like he did so many other times. There was no reason to worry, after all, she was there, lying in their bed, living the life they built together. The next morning, Daniel woke up alone. Laura was already in the kitchen, drinking coffee while using her cell phone. He watched her for a moment before approaching and kissing her shoulder, smelling the sweet scent of the perfume she wore. He asked about his plans for the day, but the answer came vague, scattered, as if it were irrelevant. He sat at the table and took a sip of his coffee, watching her carefully. She seemed calm, but there was something about that tranquility that bothered him. Maybe it was the fact that, even though she was there physically, she seemed distant, as if her mind was somewhere else. It was a strange feeling, something he couldn't define, but it was beginning to grow inside him. The day dragged by. At the office, Daniel tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to Laura. He tried to push away the repetitive thoughts, but he couldn't ignore that uncomfortable feeling, that intuition that told him something was wrong. During lunch, he took out his cell phone and sent a message to his wife, asking how her day was going. The answer came quickly and simply, "Okay. And you?" He hesitated for a moment before replying that he was busy but fine. "I wanted to ask more, I wanted to start a conversation, but I didn't want to seem insistent." Something inside him, however, compelled him to continue, to try to find a breach in that invisible wall that seemed to separate them. At night, when he got home, Laura was getting ready to go out. She was wearing an elegant black dress, her hair carefully styled, her makeup impeccable. Daniel watched her as she loosened his tie, without hiding his surprise. He asked where she was going, and Laura, without turning around, said she was going out with her friends for dinner. He nodded slowly, analyzing the scene. She rarely went out at night without him. This wasn't common, and he knew it. He tried not to show discomfort, but when she picked up her bag and walked to the door, something inside him screamed. He held her wrist for a moment, feeling the cool skin beneath his fingers, and asked if everything was okay between them. Laura smiled softly, an almost rehearsed smile, and said yes, he was exaggerating. Then, he let go of his hand and left, leaving Daniel there, standing in the middle of the room, feeling an uneasiness that he couldn't name. The following days were a reflection of this same feeling of displacement. Laura went out more than usual, she was always on her cell phone, always distracted, always with that air of someone else. Daniel tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was paranoia, but the doubts accumulated in his mind, forming a whirlwind that was impossible to contain. Until, one night, while she was sleeping next to him, he took her cell phone. He hesitated before unlocking it, feeling his heart racing in his chest. He didn't want to be that kind of man, he didn't want to invade his privacy, but the need to understand what was happening was greater than any moral principle. When the screen lit up, he saw a message notification. The name that appeared on the screen made his stomach turn. Daniel felt his blood run cold. He took a deep breath, trying to control the wave of adrenaline that took over his body. He didn't open the message. She just locked her cell phone and put it back next to her, as if nothing had happened. But at that very moment, something inside him broke. The doubts he had been trying to push away were now there, wide open, screaming to be heard. What was happening was no longer a vague suspicion, no longer a formless nuisance. It was real. And for the first time, Daniel realized that perhaps the life he had built was about to crumble before his eyes. That night seemed like any other. Daniel arrived home earlier than usual, which was rare, and found the living room empty. Only the distant noise of the television filled the space, but Laura wasn't there. He dropped his briefcase on the table, loosened his tie and took a deep breath. There was something different in the air, something he couldn't explain, but that made him uneasy. He walked to the kitchen and found a note written in her handwriting, "I'm out with the girls, I'll be back later. Don't wait up for me." He took the piece of paper and turned it between his fingers, analyzing those simple words, but they carried a strange weight. This had become too frequent. The sudden departures, the constant meetings with friends he rarely saw, the empty excuses. Once, twice, 3 times. At first, he ignored it, trying to believe it was just a phase, a search for more freedom. But now it was a standard. And patterns always hide something. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step increasing that uncomfortable feeling in his chest. In the bedroom, he threw himself on the bed and stared at the ceiling, hearing only his own heart beating in his chest. He took out his cell phone and opened the conversation with Laura. Her last message had been in the afternoon of that day, a simple, "I love you," accompanied by an emoji. And now she was out there, somewhere, without saying exactly where. Something inside him told him something was wrong. He picked up his phone and hesitated for a moment before opening the tracking app they usually used for security. His heart accelerated when he saw the location. A different neighborhood. An address that didn't belong to any friend he knew. The blood ran cold. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, about letting it go. But that instinct inside him was screaming at him to do something. He put on a jacket, grabbed his car keys and left without making a sound. He drove through the streets with his hands firmly on the steering wheel, feeling each kilometer covered as a confirmation of what he feared. The address on the map was on a quiet street, far from the center, in a more residential area. He stopped the car a few houses away, taking a deep breath, trying to rationalize. It could be anything. Maybe a friend actually lived there. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But he knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. Her car was there, parked in front of the house. The lights in the room were on. Daniel stayed there, inside the car, watching, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. He could just walk away, pretend he was never there, that he never saw anything. But he needed to know. He got out of the car and walked slowly to the house. The gate was leaning. Silently, he advanced to the window, where the curtains were only partially closed. What he saw made his stomach sink. Laura was there, inside the house, but she wasn't alone. Sitting on the couch, laughing, throwing her head back in a relaxed manner, while a man poured wine into her glass. He didn't need more than a few seconds to recognize that face. The boss. The man who was by his side every day at work, who shared meetings and signed contracts with him. The same man he respected, who he would never have suspected. There they were, sharing a moment that shouldn't exist. The touch of hands, the looks that said more than words, the evident intimacy. Laura wasn't just a woman cheating on her husband. She was too comfortable, too safe, as if that were where she belonged. Daniel felt a wave of anger rise through his body, a suffocating heat that made his breathing heavy. Every scene he witnessed hurt like a blade cutting deep. He clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palm. How long had this been going on? How many times had she left the house saying she would be with friends while she was there, in that place, on that couch, in another man's arms? Every laugh, every touch, every look was a betrayal of everything they had built together. And the worst of all, she didn't seem to hesitate. She didn't seem to care if she was caught. It felt comfortable, like there was no guilt. As if that moment were a routine, something natural. He wanted to go in there, confront them, scream, demand answers. But instead he stood still, watching, feeling his anger turn into something colder, more calculating. He wouldn't do anything now. Not at that moment. Not like that. Because something inside him said that this story wouldn't end with just an argument. This went further. They didn't just betray him. They underestimated him. And now, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a game. And he was about to change the rules. The night was thick, the silence was broken only by the muffled sound of the wind that shook the trees in the street. Daniel was sitting on the living room sofa, his fingers intertwined, his eyes fixed on his cell phone screen as he waited. He felt the weight of that weight in his chest, the tension running through every muscle in his body like an electrical wire about to explode. The audio was already recorded, each word thought out with surgical precision. He was in no hurry. I didn't want to act in the heat of emotion. I wanted every second of that revelation to be felt, for every sentence to echo in their minds with no escape. He looked at the clock. He knew that Laura was already there, at the boss's house, where so many lies had been whispered between glasses of wine and complicit looks. It was the moment. Without hesitation, he pressed the send button and dropped the cell phone on the table, watching the screen light up for a few moments before plunging into darkness. Now it was time to wait. On the other side of the city, in the large and luxurious house where the boss felt invincible, the atmosphere was one of comfort and intimacy. Laura was sitting on the sofa, her feet bare, a glass of wine between her fingers, while he walked around the room, talking about something she was barely paying attention to. His phone vibrated on the table. He glanced over, frowned when he saw Daniel's name on the screen. She noticed it too, her body stiffening slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. He took out his cell phone, slid his finger across the screen and put it on speakerphone. The audio began to play, and in the first second, Daniel's voice filled the room with a tone that carried no hesitation, no trace of doubt or lack of control. It was a cold voice, filled with something much more dangerous than anger, certainty. I imagine you are comfortable now, perhaps toasting the victory, the feeling of impunity, the game well played. I imagine you smiled many times while I, naive, continued living my life unaware of the filth that surrounded me. But you see, irony has always been a good ally of justice. Because while you were busy betraying each other between dinners and half-baked excuses, I was occupying my time with something much more interesting. I know everything. Not just about the hidden meetings, about the nights that Laura left the house pretending to be with friends, or about the quick touches in office corridors thinking that no one would see. I know everything about you, boss. I know exactly what would happen if this information got to the right place. The silence in the room was absolute. The boss felt a shiver run down his spine, his gaze became fixed on the cell phone screen as if he expected that audio to simply vanish into thin air, to evaporate along with his safety, his reputation, his life. Laura looked at him, and for the first time, she saw something she had never seen in that man, terror. Daniel continued, his voice implacable. While you felt so safe, so comfortable next to my wife, I was gathering evidence. The paperwork is complete. The accounts analyzed. The records cross-referenced. The emails that you thought were protected were properly accessed. I'm not an impulsive man. I never have been. But I've also never been one to swallow insults, I've never been one to accept a traitor getting away with it. You thought you were in control. You're not. At this point, the report has already been sent. To the shareholders. To the police. To your competitors. Tomorrow, you will wake up to a world you will no longer recognize. You will look in the mirror and see the man who destroyed everything with his own hands. The boss stood up abruptly, his heart hammering against his chest, his breathing quickened, panic transforming every drop of blood into pure despair. He ran to the table, picked up the notebook, started typing frantically, as if he could erase something, reverse something, prevent it from happening. But it was already too late. The damage was already done. Laura remained sitting, motionless, her face pale, her mouth half open as if trying to assimilate what she had just heard. Daniel hadn't just discovered the betrayal. He had destroyed the man she was involved with. The voice in the audio still had something to say. Laura, I could spend a lot of time talking about what you did, about the nights you slept next to me knowing that the next day you would run into the arms of another man. I could talk about every lie you told without blinking, about every empty, I love you, you repeated like a mechanical habit. But the truth is, I don't need to say anything. You've already lost. Not just me. Not just the house, the comforts, the plans. You've lost the one thing you may not have realized you had until now, your own worth. Because from that moment on, the only thing that will be left for you will be the shadow of that choice. And the shadows are cold, Laura. The audio has ended. The silence that followed was brutal. Laura stood up slowly, her hands shaking, her eyes watery, her breathing shallow. The boss continued to panic, typing, calling, trying to contact someone who could reverse what was irreversible. But nothing could be done. The blow had already been struck. The fall was inevitable. And Laura, for the first time since that story began, realized that she had fallen together. The cell phone slipped from Laura's hand and fell onto the soft carpet in the living room, but she didn't even move to pick it up. The weight of those words still echoed in his mind, as if the very ground beneath his feet had crumbled without warning. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, but there wasn't enough air to calm the storm that was taking her over. She looked at her boss, who was still desperate, pressing buttons on the keyboard, his gaze glued to the screen, his fingers shaking as if there was still some chance of erasing the trace of what had already been sealed. He muttered to himself, cursed, tried to convince himself that he could control the situation, but Laura knew it was useless. Daniel was not a man of empty words. If he said he had proof, it was because he did. If he promised ruin, it was because he had already arranged every detail to make it happen. She staggered back, holding on to the arm of the couch to keep from falling, and suddenly felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the door, as if the place had suddenly become a captivity, as if she were surrounded, as if the air itself was becoming poisonous. The boss's presence, once a source of forbidden excitement, was now suffocating. He turned to her, eyes filled with a terror he tried to disguise with anger. "Did you know that?" He spat out the words, his voice thick with despair and accusation. "Did he tell you something?" Any clues, anything? Laura opened her mouth, but no response came out. The lump in her throat was so strong that she could barely breathe. No, she didn't know. She never imagined that Daniel was so far ahead. She never underestimated him as a husband, but she underestimated his ability to see beyond appearances. And now? Now everything she thought she had was dissolving before her eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing from side to side, a caged animal about to attack. This cannot be happening. He must be bluffing. Someone would have warned me. I would have noticed. He slammed his hand hard on the table, causing the wine glass to tip over and the red liquid to run down the wood like blood. But Laura knew it wasn't a bluff. I knew that Daniel wouldn't have sent that audio if he hadn't been absolutely sure of what he was doing. She finally found her voice, albeit weakly, hesitantly. I need to go. I need to talk to him. The boss laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was a bitter, distorted laugh, filled with contempt and frustration. Talk to him? Now. Do you think he'll want to listen to you, Laura? Don't you understand what happened? You're just as screwed as I am. He came closer, holding her face between his fingers tightly. Did you realize he ended everything? With me, with the company, with your comfortable life? Do you think he will just forgive you? Are you going to pretend like nothing happened? Laura pulled away abruptly, feeling repulsion rising through her skin like fire. His touch, which had once caused her desire, now felt dirty, contaminated. She shook her head, trying to organize her thoughts, but it was impossible. His mind was in a whirlwind. I needed to get out of there. I needed to face Daniel, I needed to understand where this was going. She grabbed her bag and walked out the door without looking back. The cold night air hit his face, but it wasn't enough to calm the panic in his chest. She drove as if in a trance, each traffic light seeming like an endless obstacle between her and the house where she was supposed to be. The drive seemed longer than ever, and when he finally parked in the garage, he hesitated before getting out of the car. Everything looked different. The lights were off, the house was plunged into dense darkness. For the first time in years, she felt like this place no longer belonged to her. He opened the door slowly, calling for Daniel, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive. She hurried up the stairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. The room was empty. The closet, wide open. What was once a shared space between the two has now been meticulously rearranged so that only one remains. His clothes were no longer there. The belongings, the drawers, the shoes. Nothing. Just her side, intact, as if he had never been there. The shock was immediate. She stumbled backwards, hitting the wall, putting her hands in her face. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't have left. He couldn't just erase the years they had together. She ran down the stairs, opened the kitchen door, looked around as if expecting to find him there, standing there, waiting for her with a hard, cold look. But there was no one. Her cell phone vibrated in her pocket, and she answered it without even looking at the number, her voice breaking as she pronounced her name. On the other end of the line, an unfamiliar and formal voice. Good evening, ma'am. This is from the legal department of your husband's company. We have received an urgent request document related to the asset separation process. We would like to confirm a time for you to come to the office. The blood drained from his face. The legs lost strength. She leaned against the table, trying to understand what she was hearing. Separation of assets. Already? So fast. The voice on the other end waited for a response that never came. When Laura finally managed to speak, her voice was barely a whisper. Has he checked in yet? The lawyer cleared his throat before continuing. Yes, ma'am. The paperwork was sent this morning, and the request includes the immediate withdrawal of any joint financial benefits, as well as the division of assets under judicial review. From what I understand, Mr. Daniel has already arranged for him to leave the residence. Laura felt as if the world had turned. Everything was already happening. She didn't have time to react. He didn't have time to argue, to try to reverse, to ask for forgiveness. Daniel had left no room for negotiations. He simply cut her out of his life as if she were a mistake to be corrected. He hung up the phone without knowing how to breathe. The silence around him felt suffocating, crushing. She never imagined it would end like this. He never imagined that Daniel had this coldness, this precision to destroy everything in a single movement. Her body collapsed onto the kitchen floor, and she lay there, hugging her legs, trying to find some answer for a mistake that now seemed irreparable. But the truth was that there were no answers. Just consequences. The house seemed bigger now. Empty of everything that once made sense, filled only with the echo of Laura's own footsteps as she walked down the hallway, her eyes lost on the furniture that no longer looked familiar. Every corner held a memory, a reminder of what was, of what could have been, but which was now nothing more than a suffocating emptiness. Daniel's scent still permeated the pillow next to hers, like a silent ghost reminding her of the presence that had once been constant and now was nothing more than a glaring absence. She wanted to believe that this was a nightmare, that she would wake up and find everything as it always was, that she would hear the sound of the keys in the door, his voice calling her name, asking how her day was. But the silence was absolute. Daniel is gone. And there was no turning back. The cell phone on the table blinked insistently with notifications that she refused to look at. Messages from mutual friends, from his sister, even from his boss, who was now nothing more than a defeated man desperately trying to salvage the scraps of his reputation. But none of those messages mattered. None of these people could help her. She knew it was too late for explanations, excuses, or empty attempts at redemption. I knew that Daniel was not a man who left doors ajar, that once he made a decision, it was final. And the decision was made. His lawyer had been clear. Joint accounts frozen. Division of assets in progress. And most of all, Daniel was hopelessly distant. He didn't want to see her, he didn't want to talk, he didn't want to hear any explanation. He had cut every thread that connected them, done it with surgical precision, without hesitation, without allowing even a single chance for redemption. Laura wondered if he still loved her. If at some point, between the blow and the pain, he had felt a fraction of doubt, an urge to stop and reconsider. But the answer was clear. If there had been any hesitation, he would not have left without looking back. The hours dragged by, and she didn't know what to do with the time. The previous day felt like an uncontrolled avalanche, taking everything with it, and now, in the silence of the early morning, she found herself sitting in the dark living room, staring at her own reflection in the window. Who was that woman? Who was this person who had destroyed the only man who had truly loved her? He tried to remember the first time he betrayed Daniel. Of what he felt when he came home after that night. The adrenaline, the excitement, the certainty that he would never know. But now, when she looked at herself, she no longer saw that confident, seductive, full of herself woman. All I saw was regret. Too late. The time he had to repent had passed, and now all that was left was the consequence. A consequence from which there was no escape. He got up slowly, walking to the room that, until the day before, was still a couple's room. He sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress sink under his weight, Daniel's scent still there, cruelly present. She took out her cell phone and, before she could change her mind, looked for his number in her contact list. The name was still saved as Love, and it brought a suffocating tightness to his chest. The ringtone sounded once, twice, 3 times, until it went to voicemail. No surprise. No hope. But his voice was still there, on automatic recording, and it made something inside her snap. She heard the beep and, without knowing exactly what to say, the words simply came out, fragile and loaded with everything she never said while there was still time. Daniel. I know you won't hear this. And maybe I shouldn't even be calling. But I don't know what to do. I don't know how to move forward after this. You've always been my anchor, and now I'm lost, aimless. I know I have no right to ask for anything, that I'm the only one to blame for all of this, but if only you could let me explain. Not that it's going to change anything. I just wanted you to know that I never wanted it to end like this. I never wanted to lose you. She hung up, feeling the uselessness of her own words. There was no way to change what was already done. There was no justification that would erase the betrayal, that would restore trust, that would undo the pain. She lay on his pillow, closing her eyes, trying to hold on to any memory of a time when she was still loved. But what he found was the unbearable weight of emptiness. The only thing left now. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Daniel was sitting on the balcony of the small apartment he had temporarily rented. His cell phone vibrated next to him, but he didn't look. I knew who the call was from. He knew that Laura would try to talk to him, that she would say words that might have meant something before, but that were now just echoes of something that no longer existed. He had no intention of listening. Because the truth was, he didn't want to feel anything anymore. Not anger, not sadness, not longing. I wanted her to be just a distant memory, without any weight, without any trace of emotion. But he knew it wasn't that simple. He took a deep breath, looking at the city lights in the distance. He should feel vindicated, satisfied that he had dismantled everything with such precision. But deep down, there was a bitter taste. He never wanted it to end like this. I never wanted to be the man who destroys instead of builds. But Laura forced his hand. She made that choice. And he, as much as he wanted to believe that there was still something between them, knew that he could never trust her again. And without trust, there was nothing. Just ruins. He looked at his cell phone again, and for the first time that night, he hesitated. But then, in one quick movement, he turned off the device and went back into the apartment. He didn't want to hear her voice anymore. I no longer wanted to hold on to the past. The life he had with Laura was over. And now, it was time to move on. Even if the weight of it stayed with him for a long time. The dawn dragged on cruelly, turning every minute into an eternity. Laura didn't sleep. He didn't make it. His body was exhausted, but his mind would not allow rest. She turned over in the empty bed, the silence around her overwhelming. He tried to ignore the cell phone next to him, the screen dark and inert, a constant reminder of the lack of any response. She knew Daniel had heard her message. I knew he chose silence as his answer. And that choice hurt more than any words he could have said. He got up and walked to the window, hugging his arms, as if that could stop the cold that came from inside. Outside, the city remained alive, indifferent to its pain. Cars passed, lights flashed, people went on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But for her, everything was different. Time seemed to have stopped since last night. As if she were trapped in a limbo where every detail reminded her of what she lost. He felt his throat tighten, and a sob escaped before he could stop it. She closed her eyes and tried to take a deep breath. I needed to get out of there. She needed to do something, anything that would make her feel like she still had some control over her life. She picked up her bag and left the house without thinking much. He drove aimlessly, without a defined destination. She just needed to move, to escape the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a place where everything screamed Daniel's name. His heart skipped a beat when, without realizing it, he ended up stopping in front of the building where he was now living. The temporary apartment he had rented, the refuge he had found away from her. His mind screamed at him to leave, so that he wouldn't make the mistake of invading a space he clearly didn't want to share with her. But his hands were already on the steering wheel, his fingers trembling over the car key. She stayed there for a few minutes, undecided, observing the illuminated windows at the top of the building. Would he be awake? Would you be alone? Would he have thought about her at least for a moment before turning off the lights to go to sleep? Before he knew it, he was already getting out of the car, his steps hesitant but determined. The elevator seemed to move in slow motion, and with each floor that passed, I felt the weight of the decision I was making. When he reached the apartment door, he stopped. His breathing was rapid. He reached out his hand, hesitated, and then knocked. The sound echoed through the hallway, and for a moment, nothing happened. No response. No movement on the other side. He felt his heart sink. Maybe he really wasn't there. Or maybe he was just ignoring it. But then, the sound of the lock turning made her catch her breath. The door slowly opened, revealing Daniel standing there, with an expression impossible to decipher. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether he should leave her there, outside, or allow her to cross the barrier he had carefully erected between them. Laura swallowed. His eyes were red, tired, and she knew he could see the chaos inside her. "I know I shouldn't be here," she began, her voice low, almost hesitant. "But I needed to see you. I needed to tell you what I couldn't before." Daniel didn't react immediately. He remained there, watching her, as if he were waiting for something more. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Laura hesitated for a second, surprised by his attitude, but didn't waste the chance. She passed by him, feeling his presence so close, but at the same time distant as it had never been before. The apartment was simple, without many things scattered around, as if he had no intention of staying there for long. She stopped in the middle of the room, feeling the weight of that moment. He closed the door and crossed his arms, looking at her with a mix of impatience and tiredness. "Speak up, Laura. What do you want?" His coldness made her chest tighten. She didn't know exactly what she expected to find there, but it certainly wasn't this insurmountable barrier. "I know there's nothing I can say that will change what happened," she began, her voice breaking, but keeping her gaze fixed on him. "But I need you to know that none of this was a game to me. I loved you, Daniel. I still love you. And maybe it's too late, but I wanted you to know that I never thought I would lose you." He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Now do you realize that? After how many lies, Laura? After how many nights I slept next to you while you were already somewhere else? Do you want me to believe that now, just now, you realize what you lost?" She closed her eyes for a second, trying to hold back the tears. "I was a coward. I was selfish. But I never stopped loving you. I just got lost in the middle of it all. And by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flash in his eyes, perhaps a shadow of what they once felt for each other, perhaps just the remnant of a memory. But then he took a deep breath, looked away, and shook his head. "You're right about one thing," he said finally. "It's too late." Silence fell upon them like a final blow. Laura felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She knew it hurt to hear that, but nothing could prepare her for the way those words sounded, final, unbreakable. She wiped away a tear that ran down her face and nodded slowly. "So that's it?" He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "What else could it be, Laura? I spent too much time trying to understand, trying to find a reason that would make all of this make sense. But there isn't. I'm not the kind of man who can move on after this. I'm not someone who can look at you and pretend I still see the same woman I loved. Because she's gone. And what's left, isn't enough for me." Laura felt the blow in full. She wanted to fight, she wanted to say that she could change, that she could prove that there was still something there, but the truth was that some things couldn't be fixed. Some things, once broken, never go back to what they were. She took a step back, feeling reality solidify around her. "Then I'll leave," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And that I'll never forget what we had." Daniel didn't respond. He just stood there, motionless, as she turned and walked to the door. Before leaving, she gave him one last look, hoping, perhaps, that he would give some sign that there was still something there. But all he found was silence. And then, she was gone. Daniel stood in the middle of the room for a long time after the door closed. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he didn't think. He just stood there, listening to the echo of silence, feeling the weight of the decision he made. He knew it was right. But that didn't make it any less painful. Then, without looking back, he turned off the lights in the apartment and went to sleep. And for the first time since all that, I knew that the past was finally behind us. The days passed by in a blur, but for Laura, time no longer meant anything. Each morning was a repetition of the previous one, an endless void where the past seemed a constant shadow, and the future, an abyss without promises. She had returned to the house she once shared with Daniel, but that house was no longer a home. The rooms felt too big, too cold, and every object around her was a reminder of what she had lost. His absence was a ghost that haunted her, a silent echo in every corner. Nothing had more color, more meaning. The nights were long, sleepless, and silence was the worst punishment he could face. I tried to fill the hours with anything, but nothing worked. The food was tasteless, the days had no purpose, and the memories were cruel, a constant reminder of irreversible wrongdoing. She avoided going out, avoided looking people in the eye. I knew that everyone knew. She knew that their mutual friends had moved away, that her family looked at her with a mixture of pity and disappointment. And most of all, she knew Daniel wouldn't forgive her. He was not a man who left doors open to the past. He had moved on, and she was trapped, sinking deeper and deeper into the regret that consumed her. She tried to look for him one last time, but there was nothing more that could be said. He didn't answer, he didn't respond, and the truth was that she couldn't blame him. Because deep down, she knew that was the only answer she deserved. The boss did not have the same luxury of silence. His fall was swift and cruel, a complete collapse that turned his life into a public nightmare. Daniel's accusation was overwhelming, it destroyed not only his reputation, but everything he had built. In just a few days, the company he trusted so much turned its back on him, shareholders demanded explanations, contracts were broken, and when the official investigation was announced, there was nowhere left to run. His name was splashed across headlines, his career was reduced to a financial scandal, and the same contacts that had previously guaranteed him security now avoided even serving him. Money was blocked, assets confiscated, and lawsuits were piling up on his lawyers' desks. He tried to hold the pieces of his life with trembling hands, but everything crumbled before his eyes. The wife filed for divorce and took everything she could. The respect he commanded at work turned into contempt. He went from a powerful man to a joke, a clear warning to anyone who believed they were invincible. The same pride that made him believe he could take whatever he wanted was what destroyed him. And now, sitting in the tiny rented apartment with the few resources he had left, all he had was time. Time to remember the exact moment your life began to fall apart. The moment he underestimated the man he should never have cheated on. For Daniel, the reconstruction was different. He walked away from everything. He cut ties, left behind the places that brought painful memories, moved to a smaller space, where he could start over without ghosts. But even far away, even though he decided to move forward, there were scars that accompanied him. The pain of betrayal didn't disappear, it just became part of him, a shadow that sometimes whispered in silent nights. But he didn't let himself be consumed. He followed. And, along the way, he found something he didn't expect, freedom. Life without Laura was different, but little by little, I realized that it was also better. He rediscovered his identity, discovered simple pleasures that he had previously ignored, and most importantly, found the peace that her presence had taken away. It was on a random afternoon, without any warning, that destiny put someone new in your path. It wasn't a reunion with the past, nor a desperate attempt to fill the void. It was something natural, a look exchanged in a cafe, a conversation that flowed effortlessly. A smile that carried no secrets, a presence that did not carry the weight of distrust. He didn't know where it would take him, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't matter. What mattered was that after everything, after the pain and destruction, he was whole again. He had survived. Meanwhile, Laura remained where she always was, in the past. Without Daniel, without the boss, without anyone. The betrayal she committed did not take her where she imagined. It didn't give him a fresh start, it didn't bring lasting excitement. It only brought loneliness. And perhaps that was the greatest punishment of all. Not hate, not revenge, but oblivion. Knowing that, to him, she was nothing more. That he had followed without looking back. And that the world around her, like Daniel, moved on without her. And so this story ended, showing that choices have consequences and that there is not always a second chance for those who did not know how to value the first. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What was the part that impacted you the most? Leave your comment below, I want to hear your opinion. And of course, if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now for more stories like this. Here, betrayal is never romanticized, because we always believe that each choice has its price. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next story.